Welcome, sisters and brothers, to our third episode of the Gospel of Mark. This is the eve of Chinese New Year, and I'm sure a lot of you are going to be watching it well after the eve, because I do hope you're having a good time celebrating with family, but staying safe, of course. So, a happy New Year to all of you. As we come today, we allow the Lord to continue to be a part of our lives as we examine what His Word has to say for us. And so let's get into the scriptures. The Word of God is something alive and active. It cuts more incisively than any two-edged sword. It can seek out the place where the soul is divided from spirit or joints from marrow. It can pass judgment on secret emotions and thoughts. Dear Lord, as we come to examine the Word today, as we continue on our journey through Mark, may your Word come alive. May your Word become active in our own lives. As we journey forth, may this experience be an experience not just for the mind, but more importantly, for our hearts and our lives. We make our prayer through Christ our Lord. Amen. So as we did last week, there were questions done at the beginning of the encounter, and so I'm going to look at some of those questions. There is this question here which asks the question, why does the Bible refer to the mustard seed as coming from a tree with branches when it really is only a bush? When we were in Jerusalem, I never saw a mustard tree, but mustard bushes. Well, I'm showing you different examples on the pictures there. There is a nice big tree, there's bushes, there's shrubs. So mustard bushes reach an average mature height of between 6 and 20 feet, with a 20-foot spread, although exceptional plants can reach 30 feet tall under ideal conditions. I've looked at the different translations, and again, this is that beautiful thing of learning Greek. The word for mustard seeds are dendron. And the translations in English sometimes give it as bushes, sometimes as trees. So therein is our problem. But you can see the thing is that, yes, you're right. It is sometimes referred to as a bush, and the picture right at the top looks like more of a bush, large bush, because it's much taller than the man that's standing there. But you can also see it as a cover crop with these lovely flowers that are on this side as well. So that's my little explanation to that question that was sent. Next question is a lot harder to talk about because there is a strong and consistent messaging around casting out demons. Why is this emphasized in Mark's gospel? And is this saying anything about the audience to whom he writes, the community of believers? Well, exorcism was something that was seen in the time of Jesus. It was not just something that Jesus did. There were others who went into exorcisms. There were exorcisms that were done through magic, and a spiritual power was called up to evict a spirit. And yes, there's an example of Josephus giving an example of a Jew performing exorcism by putting a finger ring to the nose of the sufferer, and as the person smelled pungent roots in it, it drew out the demon. Now that's something magical there. And then the person used poems and stuff to order that the demon would never return. So that's one explanation. But there were also exorcisms performed by charismatic magicians. And yes, we hear the story of, Saul beset with evil spirits, while David cured him by playing his harp and chanting his songs. So that's one example. But there were also others where exorcisms from charismatics. There is a guy called Simon ben Yose who was said to have cast out a demon by calling Ben Tamalion, get out. And this was very much about a word that was said, but also success was dependent, it was thought, on the personal force of the exorcist. Now, we see that in the stories, and we're going to enter into one of those stories immediately after this. So we will see that in Mark's gospel, Jesus' authority over demonic powers is well documented, okay? Jesus has to say the word and the demons were silenced. And so there's no real preparation on the part of the sufferer. The word just has an effect. Very often there is a change in the life of the sufferer, very often also in the lives of people around them, because obviously they're going to be affected by it. Very often increased faith. So there was no question mark about Jesus' power to exorcise demons, because that's what other Jews did as well. But there is a big difference between the ordinary Jewish and pagan exorcists using incantations, magic rites, spells, and that sort of thing. But with Jesus, here it is simply the word. A word, clear and simple, with authority. Jesus had authority, and we see divine power exorcise the demons. So there's something about the authority of Jesus that we see being manifest. And Jesus came to help us find freedom. And so he overthrew Satan by freeing and releasing its prisoners. So what is the aim of Mark in documenting these exorcisms? It's not to praise Jesus, but rather to help the Jews know that Jesus had power over Satan and that he is the Messiah. Yes, the anointed one. And also to help them see that there was this promise from God that they would be set free. And indeed, others are also set free from the bondage of the evil one. And finally, for all of us to find freedom from sin and anguish. And so that was it. However, we need to distinguish between exorcisms and healings that Jesus performed. Normally, when it comes to the healings, you see Jesus touch the sick, or he lifted up a lame man or something. There was some sort of physical sort of aspect to it. But exorcisms were different. Jesus normally simply addressed the demon with a short and authoritative command, and it left. Sometimes with a bit of protest, but that was all he needed to do. So let's perhaps move on to what we have today, because there is exactly this in our first episode in Mark 5. And what we're seeing there is they came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gerasenes. Now, some of your texts will say Gadarenes, and this is a bit of a problem because this is a question of textual criticism. So it's a question of some of the early texts having a different word there. And so is it the Gerasenes or is it the Gadarenes? Because the problem will be that it puts the location as slightly different. But that's not going to be a big issue for us. But I just want to highlight the fact that the ancient texts sometimes had slight differences because we're not sure which is the older of the texts. Ordinarily, we would say that the oldest text would be the authentic one. But sometimes things, were changed, or that the scribes who are copying the text may have made a mistake or thought that they were correcting a mistake. And so these are anomalies that happen. And we go to verse 2. And when he had stepped out of the boat, and he obviously is Jesus here, the context will, when we see the previous chapter, immediately a man out of the tombs with an unclean spirit met him. He lived among the tombs, and no one could restrain him anymore, even with a chain. For he had been restrained with shackles and chains, but the chains he wrenched apart, and the shackles he broke to pieces. And no one had the strength to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and on the mountains, he was always howling and bruising himself with stones. Now, if you think of this person, everybody would have been scared of him. But if you think of him as a human being suffering in the way that he was, that was really sad, isn't it? And he's living out in the tombs, far away from people, in a place that would be considered unclean for most people because of the association with death. And so he's probably staying there because, no one wants him near them. And he's probably afraid of people, even though he's obviously strong. But this is his condition. A man who is struggling with life, very lonely, obviously, and very oppressed. And so when he saw Jesus from a distance, he ran and bowed down before him. And he shouted at the top of his voice, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God?" Notice that. He knows who Jesus is. While a lot of the scribes and Pharisees are not going to be able to acknowledge Jesus as who he is, this man is able to say that. "I adjure you by God, do not torment me." And why is he saying that? For Jesus had said to him, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirits." And so Jesus had been speaking to that spirit that was in that man. And then Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" And now we're not talking of the man, but rather the spirit within that man. He replied, "My name is Legion, for we are many." So this man is beset by many spirits in him. A legion is a large number of people, or not people, but large number of spirits are here in this context. And so it sort of helps us to see that this man is very much affected by what's in him. And he begged him earnestly not to send them out of the country. Oh, so they don't want to go too far away. Interesting, I wonder why. Now there on the hillside, a great herd of swine was feeding. Now, by the way, this should help us see that this is pagan territory. Jesus has just taken a little trip outside of Jewish territory, and we're seeing him actually encountering non-Jewish people. And this is that first little incursion into pagan territory. Now the unclean spirits begged him, "Send us into the swine, let us enter them." Ooh. So he gave them permission. And the unclean spirits came out and entered the swine, and the herd, numbering about 2,000. So now we understand what legion was. 2,000. I mean, assuming that one, demon went into each swine, rushed down the steep bank into the sea and were drowned in the sea. The swineherds ran off and told it in the city and in the country. I'm sure the swineherds weren't very happy with Jesus. Because, that's good pork that's gone missing, isn't it? Then people came to see what it was that had happened. They came to Jesus and saw the demoniac sitting there. Now, see the difference. Clothed and in his right mind. The very man who had had the legion, and they were afraid. I wonder why they were afraid. Very often we are afraid of things we don't understand. And maybe they thought this man had new powers or whatever it is that Jesus had done to him, and was Jesus going to do some more stuff? And I would be very afraid if I was a swineherd. I've lost my pigs. What else am I going to lose? So those who had seen what had happened to the demoniac and to the swine reported it. Then they began to beg Jesus to leave their neighborhood. If you like pork, you can understand why, isn't it? And if you sell pork, surely that's a good reason to say, Jesus, you're not welcome here. Tough. And so as he was getting into the boat, the man who had been possessed by demons begged him that he might be with him. So this man wants to follow Jesus. Earlier, Jesus had said to individuals, follow me. But here Jesus refuses and said to him instead, go home to your friends. Go home to your friends and tell them how much that the Lord has done for you and what mercy he has shown you. Now, this is in contrast to Jesus earlier saying, keep quiet, don't tell anybody. Now, this is a question that we will have to deal with later. Some of you have already asked the question, why does Jesus not want people to say this to everybody? Now, hold your horses. I'm going to deal with that, but at the appropriate time. I just want to show you that it's not always that Jesus says, keep quiet. But we will deal with it very soon. And he went away and began to proclaim in the Decapolis. The Decapolis is a region, you can see it on the map there, of 10 cities. Deca, 10 polis cities. How much Jesus had done for him. So this man is become an evangelizer before anybody else has got into the job. Interesting, isn't it? So the first evangelizer, as far as Mark is concerned, and with remit or with permission from Jesus, with instruction from Jesus, go and tell. And this is what he says. But certainly he goes to not just to home to his friends, but he goes wider than I can't imagine that he's got friends in 10 cities, but he's gone around sharing good news, because good news about what Jesus had done for him. And so it's not just an abstract good news, but it's what God had done in his life. And that's an important thing, isn't it? Very often, we talk of good news in abstract terms, but perhaps we need to be recognizing that when we share good news, it's also about the good things God has done in our own lives. When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, presumably this is back to the Jewish side again, and it is. A great crowd gathered round him, and he was by the sea. Now, we see Jesus often by the sea because that's his amphitheater in a sense, that idea of being by the sea, especially in a boat where everybody is listening to him there. Then one of the leaders of the synagogue named Jairus came And when he saw him, fell at his feet. Notice that. And begged him repeatedly, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live." The fact that he falls on his feet is showing not just that he's wanting a favor. The term there is about falling at his feet as if it was in terms of worship, in one sense. And can you see that this is a man with faith? Because he says, "Come so that she may be made well and live." So he wants healing and that his daughter might live. And notice he begged him repeatedly. So there is a whole load of desire for something to be done. There is a whole load of faith repeatedly asking Jesus. And so Jesus went with him. So he went with him, and a large crowd followed him and pressed in on him. So this is the problem, because now this is no longer some one man with Jesus, but there are others who come along. But notice that they're going to be witnesses to what Jesus does. Now suddenly you see it's changed. The story has moved towards another story. And this is what Mark does quite a lot. You will notice this later. It's almost that he puts a sandwich. And so we're going into another story, and we'll come back to Jairus later. So this is another story inserted within the larger story, and we're seeing something else. So now there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. She had endured much under many physicians and had spent all that she had, and she was no better, but rather grew worse. Now here I want to say that this is not just about the fact that she was sick. Having hemorrhages would have meant that she would have been considered unclean in that time. And therefore, anybody coming into contact with her, including her husband, would have been thought to be unclean if they had that contact. Her own family would have had to keep a distance if they wanted to remain clean. So she would have not been able to go out, and she would also have not been able to go to the synagogue or even to the temple. And so this is someone who's almost being told that, hey, even God, you can't go to. She might have been able to cry out personally to God, but even the temple where she might have wanted to go and offer sacrifice, to pray, that is out of bounds to her as well. So can you see the isolation that she faces? She's struggling. So she had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. For she said, "If I but touch his clothes, I will be made well." Now, notice the faith there. I will be made well. A woman of faith, despite her desperation and despair, she seems to know that if she would just touch the cloak. She doesn't even touch Jesus. She touches the cloak. And perhaps she's not touching Jesus because maybe she was scared that she would render him unclean. So maybe just the cloak. But even the cloak is good enough, she thinks. And indeed, 29, immediately her hemorrhage stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. So can you see the immediate effect that this has on her? the power of Jesus in the life of this woman. Immediately aware that power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" Now, and the disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing in on you. How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" Because the reality is that in a big crowd, you can't tell who's touching you because they're all there. They're all clamoring to have a piece of Jesus, as it were. They all want to touch Jesus. He looked around, all around, to see who had done it. He looks around, but the woman comes up to him. Verse 33. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, notice that knowing, came in fear and trembling. I wonder why she's in fear and trembling. Fell down before him and told him the whole truth. Fear and trembling, why? I mean, she's been freed. She should be rejoicing, isn't it? But maybe she realizes that she has encountered something far bigger than herself. Maybe she realizes that she has encountered God. And that's why she's come in fear and trembling, because in those days, there was this thinking that if you came too close to God, you might die. She fell down before him, and that fell down before him is yet again a sign of great respect or even worship. And she told him the whole truth. And I wonder what that whole truth was. It's possibly that she told him more than just, I touched you and I've been made clean and healed. But maybe she told him, I don't know. I mean, the text doesn't say, and maybe I'm presuming too much, but maybe there was something that Jesus knew from his encounter with her, whether it was said or unsaid, something about her loneliness, her despair, her desperation. And what does Jesus say to her? He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." Your faith has made you well. Remember how she knew that if I just touch, I'll be okay. There was such great faith there. And Jesus sends her off, "Go in peace and be healed of your disease." But I'm saying the healing that would have taken place is not just a physical healing. It's also a social, a religious, a spiritual healing, because now she's reunited with her family, her loved ones, her husband, her children. She's able to mix around in society yet again, so she can be part of her friends. More importantly, she can go to worship in the temple if she needs to. She can pray with all her heart, because there is nothing ritually unclean about her that makes it impossible or wrongful to pray or worship. Wow, the power of faith in that woman. Your faith has made you well. Now we're coming back to the story of Jairus and his daughter. So we've gone to the middle of that sandwich, we've seen that, and now we're coming back to another story of faith. Because Jairus also had faith, if you remember. So while he was still speaking, some people came from the leader's house to say, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" Terrible to hear that, isn't it? I mean, what a letdown. He's gone to Jesus, he's encountered Jesus, and he's on the brink of bringing Jesus home, and they're saying, "Don't bother. She's dead." But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the leader of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." Earlier, the man showed a great deal of faith. Perhaps that faith was dissipating, but Jesus says, "Do not be afraid, only believe." Now, I want to say something about do not fear or do not be afraid. Very often we have a lot of fears. Fear is part of our human condition. A lot of people will tell us that if you check the entire Bible, this phrase, do not be afraid or do not fear, appears 365 times at least. So there's enough for one a day. So let's not be afraid. We're not in a leap year, so it's not 366 anyway. So each day, perhaps we need to hear and tell ourselves if we are overwhelmed by our fears, do not fear, only believe. And perhaps that's that encouragement to us. Believe that despite our fears, God is going to do something with whatever our situation is in life. So, this time round, he allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. So the crowd is left behind. But there's another crowd to encounter in a little while. Because we see in verse 38, when they came to the house of the leader of the synagogue, he saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. It's almost as if the funeral has begun. The wailing, the mourning is part of all that. And when he had entered, he said to them, "Why do you make a commotion and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping." Now, sometimes people used sleep as a metaphor for death. But here Jesus is obviously not saying that she's not dead, because she's saying she's not dead, she's sleeping. So he's referring to she's having a nap. And they laughed at him because, she's dead. What do you expect now, Jesus? What do you expect? Then he put them all outside. Now, Peter, James, and John as well. And he took the child's father and mother and those who were with him. James and John and Peter come along. And went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha kum," which means, "Little girl, get up." Another translation would be, "Little girl, arise." And the verb that's used there is also the same verb that is used for resurrection, which we will encounter much later. This perhaps is pointing to something way ahead, his own resurrection. But let's hold that in abeyance. Talitha kum, little girl, get up. And immediately, again, can you see that word euthus comes yet again? The girl got up and began to walk about. She was 12 years of age, soon to be a woman, but they're referring to her as a girl. At this, they were overcome with amazement. He strictly ordered them that no one should know this. A bit hard, isn't it? Because the funeral's almost begun outside, and she's going to come out, and they're going to say, "Hey, what happened?" A bit hard, Jesus, to keep a secret about you. Good news is hard to contain, and yet sometimes we don't share good news. The next line is interesting. And told them to give her something to eat. Why do you think this is? Some scholars have suggested that it's not just the fact that she's been, dehydrated or hungry or whatever it is, but also if she is indeed a ghost, ghosts cannot eat. That was the understanding. So if she eats, that proves that she is back to her old self. It's her, not some ghost and some manifestation. A little bit more about that. Yet again, two women, one older, one younger, who come. Firstly, it was the father's faith, and the woman with the hemorrhage had her own faith. And we see healings happening. Again, there was something physical, isn't it? That woman touched his garment, and here he took her by the hand. So remember what I said about possession, and this is not a possession as such. This is a healing. We've done one chapter. Now, he left that place and came to his hometown. Hometown. And his disciples followed him. On the Sabbath, he began to teach in the synagogue. And many who heard him were astounded. They said, "Where did this man get all this? What is his wisdom that has been given to him? What deeds of power are being done by his hands? Is not this the carpenter, the son of Mary and the brother of James and Joseph and Judas and Simon? And are not his sisters here with us?" We've heard this before, isn't it? There's question marks about, we know this guy. We know him, and, he's the carpenter. I suppose, it's hard to imagine a carpenter can do what Jesus has been doing. And also, they would have heard perhaps also some of his wisdom. So there's something about the teaching as well as the deeds of power. And they took offense at him. They didn't like what they saw. They didn't appreciate Jesus for who he was and perhaps who he had become, although perhaps that was hidden from them all the time. He was that. And Jesus said to them, "Prophets are not without honor except in their hometown and among their own kin and in their own house." And he could do no deed of power there except that he laid his hands on a few sick people and cured them. And he was amazed at their unbelief. Then he went about among the villages teaching. He called the 12 and began to send them out 2 by 2. And he gave them authority over the unclean spirits. Interesting that is mentioned right at the beginning. He ordered them to take nothing for their journey except a staff, no bread, no bag, no money in their belts, but to wear sandals and not to put on 2 tunics. Now, what's this about? Ordinarily, if you and I go on a journey, we're going to take all that we need, isn't it? But, Jesus is traveling light, so there's not going to be excess baggage to be paid for. Jesus is telling them, travel light, in fact, travel empty, no hand luggage even. Just a staff, but they wear sandals because, I guess they're going long journeys and barefoot would be difficult. So no bread, no bag, no money in their belts. So that means that they have to be completely at the mercy of whoever they meet and whoever gives them whatever they need to eat or to live on while they're away. Not even to wear 2 tunics. Why a second tunic? In case it gets too cold and that becomes their blanket. Let your host provide everything. And he said to them, whenever you enter a house, stay there until you leave the place. Stay there. The idea here is don't go from house to house hoping that you might get a better cook in the next house. Don't go to a nicer room in another house. Stay where you are. Be focused. Be focused on what you are there for. If any place will not welcome you and they refuse to hear you, as you leave, shake off the dust that is on your feet as a testimony against them. Almost as if to say, well, if you don't want it, I have nothing more to do with you. So they went out and proclaimed that all should repent. Remember, turn away from sin and believe in the good news. Mark 1:15. So they cast out many demons and anointed with oil many who were sick and cured them. So we're seeing something about anointing there, the anointing of the sick, and healing taking place as a result. Now, King Herod heard of it, for Jesus' name had become known. Some were saying John the Baptizer had been raised from the dead, and for this reason, these powers are at work in him. But others said, it is Elijah. And others said, it is a prophet like one of the prophets of old. But when Herod heard of it, he said, John, whom I beheaded, has been raised. So Herod thinks that John, who was already beheaded, has come alive again. Notice the connection being made again with John the Baptist, as we saw at the beginning of the gospel when John baptized Jesus. But John was not equal to Jesus, and John knew that. But Herod thinks, has he been raised? And now we're going to get the story of how John died. For Herod himself had sent men who arrested John, bound him, and put him in prison on account of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife. Why? Because Herod had married her. His brother Philip's wife, and Herod has acquired her as a wife. For John had been telling Herod, it is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife. Jewish law didn't permit that. It was as if you're marrying your sister because your brother's wife has become your sister. So it was almost as if it was such an abomination. And Herodias, the woman, had a grudge against him and she wanted to kill him. Basically because John said something about her in the process. But she could not, for Herod feared John, knowing that, he was a righteous and holy man, and he protected him until now. He knew he was a righteous and holy man. So he must have known that if he sees him as righteous and holy, he must have known that what John had said to him was the truth. But Herod was not ready to repent. Herod was not ready for a change of life, conversion was not what he wanted. So we're told, when he heard him, he was greatly perplexed. And yet, he liked to listen to him. So, Herod listens, but he's not allowing his life to be changed. What kind of soil is that? He's confused, but he likes to listen. But he's not going to listen for very much longer. An opportunity came when Herod, on his birthday, gave a banquet for his courtiers and others, and for the leaders of Galilee. And when his daughter Herodias came in and danced, she pleased Herod and his guests, and the king said to the girl, "Ask me for whatever you wish, and I will give it." Ooh. I'm wondering what kind of dance was that he was so enamored by that dance. And he solemnly swore to her, "Whatever you ask me, I will give you, even half of my kingdom." Ooh, that's big stuff, isn't it, for a dance? She went out and said to her mother, "What should I ask for?" Good girl. She goes to consult her mother. But the problem is, the mother's not exactly a nice woman, isn't it? She replied, "The head of John the Baptizer." Oof. But you notice that the girl immediately, she rushed back to the king and requested. Immediately. There's no thinking behind it. There is no, is this right? Is this wrong? She says, "I want you to give me at once, immediately, the head of John the Baptist on a platter." Rather gruesome, isn't it? Be prepared for a gruesome picture next. The king was deeply grieved because, remember, he was perplexed, yet he liked to listen to John. Yet out of regard for his oath and for the guests, he did not want to refuse her. What sort of king is that? No authority of his own, isn't it? He's not able to stand and say, "Well, I made a mistake. I shouldn't have said you can have anything you want. This you cannot have." He could have said that. And after all, he's the king. He might have looked a little bit bad, possibly that it was a party. There was he probably had too much to drink, and he could have said, "Well, I was too drunk to know really what I was saying." But we're told in verse 27, immediately the king sent a soldier of the guard with orders to bring John's head. He went and beheaded him in the prison, brought his head on a platter and gave it to the girl. Then the girl gave it to her mother. When his disciples heard about it, they came and took his body and laid it in a tomb. His body, headless body. We're not told what Herodias did with that head. But I guess what it was simply, if I can have the head, I know that he is well and truly dead. But here we are seeing the weakness of King Herod, who was not able to stand up to his wife or the people that had heard his oath. He was a coward. And sometimes this is us, isn't it? We're not able to stand up for what is right. Yes, we've made mistakes, but we should be able to go back and say, "Well, I made a mistake and I need to amend what I said or what I did. Some things cannot be unsaid, some things cannot be undone, but I can say the truth now and recognize that, yes, I made a mistake. Now, we're coming back. Again, this is a bit of a sandwich. The apostles were sent, and suddenly we went into that story of John the Baptist. So now they're coming back. The apostles gathered around Jesus and told him all that they had done and taught. Now, notice, he says, come away to a deserted place all by yourselves and rest a while. Come away to a deserted place all by yourselves and rest a while. I want to say something about this because sometimes we all work too hard and we don't seem to recognize that we need to be able to rest a while. The deserted place is to be away from everybody else, to be by ourselves, and presumably we recognize that God is there, and to rest. I think this is not just a question of physical rest, but it's also spiritual rest. And in that time, it's a time to reflect and allow ourselves to see, what is God doing in our lives? What's happening to my life? Basically, Jesus is telling them, come and have a mini retreat. For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. So this is the danger. Sometimes we can think that we've got so much to do, we've got to do it. I know I'm guilty of this sometimes. We think that, we've got to do it. Hey, self-care is also important. Loving yourself is also important. There's sometimes we do too much for everybody else, but if we don't care for ourselves, who's going to do the caring for us? Now, let's not get overboard and become so preoccupied with ourselves. But certainly, do we have enough rest? Do we have enough sleep? Do we have nourishing food? Those are questions that we need to ask ourselves in order that we may have energy to continue the journey of discipleship, to continue the journey in the kingdom. Now, many saw them going and recognized them, and they hurried there on foot from all the towns and arrived ahead of them. You can't run away, isn't it? As soon as that retreat is over, back into the fray. As they went ashore, they saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them. Compassion for them. His heart went out to them. Why? Because they were like sheep without a shepherd. Now, the metaphor of sheep and shepherd is something that you see in the Old Testament quite a lot. The idea of a shepherd guiding his sheep. Because without the shepherd, the wolf or other enemies can come and take away the sheep. The sheep are sometimes silly enough to stray, to go wrong directions. And there needs to be someone to keep them together as a flock. They were like sheep without a shepherd, going astray, nobody to hold them together and keep them as Jesus wanted to. So there was this compassion that he had for them. His heart goes out towards them. And he began to teach them many things. Again, Mark doesn't tell us what these many things are. We're told earlier that he taught them using parables. But here we don't know what these many things are. When it grew late, his disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place and the hour is now very late. Send them away so that they may go into the surrounding country and villages and buy something for themselves to eat." Logical, isn't it? I mean, otherwise, what are you going to do? No catering there. But he answered them, "You give them something to eat." Or what do you expect, Jesus? They said to him, "Are we to go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread?" A denarius was 1 day's wages for a worker. So to find 200 denarii worth of bread, that's a lot of money, and give it to them to eat? And he said to them, "How many loaves have you? Go and see." When they had found out, they said, 5 and 2 fish. Now, in Mark's gospel, we don't have the story of the little boy. That's elsewhere. So this is where each gospel writer, each evangelist, puts in some details and leaves out some others. But the fact is, 5 loaves, 2 fish. So they ordered them to get all the people to sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in groups of hundreds and of 50s. So fairly big groups, but it's a bit better to organize them. So one would see groups of people, hundreds or 50s. So I guess you can sort of like help with the sending of food quantities. But you've only got 5 loaves and 2 fish. What are you doing, Jesus? Verse 41. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to his disciples to set before the people. And he divided the 2 fish among them all. I've highlighted in verse 41 some of the verbs that we see. Take, bless, break, give. Why have I done that? Because you know where else we've heard these 4 verbs in succession. Let me help you. He took the bread, he broke it, and he gave it to, he blessed it first, he broke it, and he gave it to his disciples. We hear this at every Mass, don't we? At every Eucharist, we hear this actions of Jesus. Take, bless, break, and give. These are actions that kind of point to the Eucharist that we're going to encounter later. This is not the Eucharist. This is not bread and wine. This is bread and fish. But it's kind of an akandatang, a foretaste of what they will see later. Take, bless, break, and give. And all ate and were filled, and they took up 12 baskets full of broken pieces and of the fish. 12 baskets. Now, 5 loaves, 2 fish. But now you've got 12 baskets. So you end up with more than you started off with in the first place. There's lots of leftovers for anybody who wants a meal tomorrow or wants supper later. And notice that 12. 12 is significant because there were 12 tribes of Israel. And it's as if there's enough that Jesus gives for every one of Israel's tribes. That there's enough for all of Israel. And we're told those who had eaten the loaves numbered 5,000 men. Here it doesn't say not to mention the women and children, but we see that 5,000 men and 5 loaves and 2 fish. The power of Jesus in this miracle. The power, notice that it's in verse 41, he looked up to heaven. And so in doing this miracle, he is in connection with his Father, with the Spirit. This is not something he does solitarily. Yes. 5 loaves and 2 fish. Immediately, he made his disciples get into the boat and go on to the other side, to Bethsaida, while he dismissed the crowd. After saying farewell to them, he went up on the mountain to pray. Yet again, notice that Jesus recognizes the need to be in communion with God the Father. He thrives not on 5 loaves and 2 fish. We don't hear of him eating so much. We hear of him going off to pray often. And that's perhaps a reminder to us as well. The danger is that we can sometimes think that we can go on and on and on without the power of prayer in our lives. Prayer is not just about asking for things. Prayer is being with God to allow him to replenish in our lives all that is missing, all that we need. When evening came, the boat was out on the sea, and he was alone on the land. So there in the sea, he's on the land. When he saw that they were straining at the oars against an adverse wind, he came to them early in the morning, walking on the sea. Wow. He intended to pass them by. But when they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost and cried out. For they all saw him and were terrified. Oh, they didn't recognize him. But immediately he spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." Take heart, take courage. It is I. Now this is interesting. It is I. Ego eimi is what it says in Greek. It is I. And that's the same as I am who I am. The word for Yahweh in Hebrew. And perhaps there is a little clue about it is I, referring to it is I am who I am. Is perhaps in a kind of cryptic way telling them something about that he's God. But I don't think they're getting it yet. Post the fact, we'll understand that. But he goes on to say, do not be afraid. Again, do not be afraid. So perhaps you may want to ask yourself, what are the storms? What are the winds in your life? Can we recognize the presence of Jesus in the storm, in our fear? Take heart. It is I. Do not be afraid. Then he got into the boat with them, and the wind ceased. When we realize that Jesus is with us, the winds cease. When we realize his presence, the need to be afraid disappears. Yes. And they were utterly astounded, for they did not understand about the loaves. They didn't understand that whole miracle. For them is, we got the job done. We fed the folks. But their hearts were hardened. Now, this is strange, isn't it? Because these are the guys who went out, proclaimed, came back happy, but still their hearts were hardened. Sometimes we have hard hearts as well, isn't it? We are not able to see what God is doing, and sometimes we don't want to see. Sometimes we're struggling with what's really plainly in front of us, but we don't want to see. We don't want to recognize that God is doing wonderful things in our lives. When they had crossed over, they came to land at Gennesaret and moored the boat. When they got out of the boat, the people at once recognized him and rushed about that whole region and began to bring the sick on mats to wherever they heard he was. So yet again, the crowds are coming. And wherever he went, into villages or cities or farms, they laid the sick in the marketplace and begged him that they might touch even the fringe of his cloak. And all who touched it were healed. All were healed. Obviously, there's a lot of faith there. And perhaps sometimes we say, well, why not healing for me? Why not? Why am I not getting the healing that I want? Why not the instantaneous healing that I desire? Tough one, that one, isn't it? In his time, according to his will, is all I can say for now. So please send any questions. I'm thankful to those who have sent your questions. Some of these questions are waiting to be answered at the right time. Thank you for joining me in the session. And as I said earlier, for those of you who are celebrating Chinese New Year or the Lunar New Year, may the blessings of God be with you all. Remember the words we said: take, bless, break, give. Bless. We often want blessings to fall from heaven, isn't it? Perhaps he's blessed you so that you might be a blessing to others. May we all be that blessing. God bless you. May the word come alive and be active in your lives.